So thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to begin by the protocol matters, which are so important in my department. So to the General Secretary of the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa, the National Executive Committee members of the Evangelical Alliance, church leaders of the Alliance, ladies and gentlemen joining us today. In my party, the African National Congress, we often organize public meetings. And, you always have the expectation and hope that you'll address a full room. But sometimes you get to a room and it's not as full as you anticipate. So we have a saying, we say fewer but better, because it means those who are there really come in order to listen and hopefully learn. And so the fewer, the better, because you've got intellectual weight in the presence of those who are seriously interested in the message that you hope to convey. So don't worry, not worried about the number in the room, because fewer but better. I wish to begin by thanking you for allowing me to speak to you about the troubling situation in Palestine. As South Africans, particularly democratic South Africa, we share a common sense of solidarity with the people of Palestine who have been waging a struggle for self-determination and justice for over 75 years. On the 27th of April, we were celebrating our 30th anniversary of freedom. But of course, because we achieved that freedom through a process of struggle, it's imperative that we never forget that our freedom was born out of struggle, and that we always would, as South Africans, given our history, have an appreciation of the troubles and challenges that confront people who face oppression, who face denial of basic human rights. For many people, the Palestinian question has been alert in their minds merely for the past 6 months, because the world has suddenly witnessed a catastrophic military onslaught on Gaza, which has spared no resident in that area, and which has become what many have begun to describe as hell on earth. For us as South Africa, the experience of the people of Gaza is not something that we became alert to on October 8. We as South Africa did something very, very interesting when we were prosecuting our own struggle for freedom. We had leadership in South Africa of the freedom struggle who decided to go out into the rest of the world to convince all leaders all over the world that there was an abuse of human rights taking place in apartheid South Africa, and that the world had a duty to support the people of South Africa in their struggle for freedom. This program, led primarily by the liberation movements, was a program that sought to establish a movement internationally of anti-apartheid supporters in what came to be called an international solidarity campaign. Many people don't often appreciate the degree to which international solidarity contributed to our struggle. For some of you, your sisters, your brothers, your daughters, your fathers, your uncles, your aunts, cousins, left South Africa because they intended to become freedom fighters. They found themselves in camps in Zambia, in camps in Angola, in residences in Mozambique. They found themselves in Sudan. Some landed in Palestine, some in Libya, in various parts of the world. They arrived there with no money, some with no passport. And yet, the world, taking on this request for international solidarity, said, we'll provide you with clothes, we'll provide you with food, we'll provide you with an education opportunity. This was international solidarity. In addition, after persuasion, many countries in the world agreed that they would begin to impose pressure on apartheid South Africa by having sanctions on trade with apartheid South Africa. So that's how the sanctions movement began. It's important that we have this understanding of international solidarity as South Africans, because while indeed it is true that the mass struggle in our country and the underground struggle were significant contributors to our freedom, the international dimension was important as well, as was the armed struggle. Our struggle for freedom had many facets to it, and none of those facets can be regarded as negligible or unimportant. And to understand who we are as South Africans, we have to take each of those facets of struggle, each of those elements into account in understanding who we are. So, let me return then. With respect to Palestine, there are a range of commentators that are beginning to talk and describe and describe what has been occurring in the occupied territories. And let us always explain that occupied territories means another state is occupying land that is not legally theirs. This is not what Naledi Pandor is saying. This is confirmed by dozens of United Nations resolutions that have been voted on by member states of the United Nations and that clearly articulate the fact that Israel is illegally occupying territories of Palestine. And this is a fact that we also need to take into account as we look at these matters. When you talk to humanitarian organizations from the United Nations, they say they have never, in all their careers, witnessed the devastation and suffering they're seeing in Gaza today. And they say this suffering has become worse each day since the bombardment began. We, of course, also know that we had the horrific attack of October 7th by Hamas on innocent Israeli citizens, as well as the taking of hostages by Hamas. And as the government of South Africa, we have been consistent in calling for the release of hostages alongside calling for a ceasefire in Palestine. Now, why do we take such interest, apart from that history I've given you of our international solidarity and our struggle for freedom? Well, first, I think it's always important to remind South Africans that you are the one country in the world that made the decision when you were drafting your policies that your foreign policy will be underpinned by the concept of Ubuntu. I hope you all understand what Ubuntu means. It means I am a person because I recognize that you are a person. It's an understanding that all of us are part of humanity. And it further tells us that our freedom cannot be regarded as complete freedom until all people, including Palestinians, are free. Because as long as you are a person who doesn't enjoy freedom, my freedom is half. It's only when all of us collectively enjoy the same that our Ubuntu is confirmed. So Ubuntu is a very important concept for us to understand, and we framed it into our foreign policy as a key concept that would guide how we execute our foreign policy. We further hold the belief that the multilateral system, by that we mean institutions to which all states of the globe belong, such as the United Nations, that the multilateral system must function effectively to prevent crimes against humanity, to prevent violations of human rights and genocide. Let me explain. After the First World War, you'll recall we had the First World War 1914 to 1919. We then had the Treaty of Versailles. We then had the idea of forming the League of Nations. And what these processes sought to do was to create universal instruments, universal laws that would seek to protect humanity in case of global wars. So you had a process in which we began to put rules in place that would ensure, even when there's a war, that there would be rules, that if you capture prisoners, you could only treat them in a particular way. You wouldn't torture them, you wouldn't murder them, you wouldn't imprison them in inhumane conditions. That if you entered an area in which there were civilians who were not part of the war, you wouldn't murder them, you wouldn't imprison them and detain them, you wouldn't torture, and so on. So rules began to be framed. And these rules are framed increasingly in what we call international conventions and international protocols. These are the frameworks or rules that govern how we behave toward each other in situations of crises and war. This had not been done adequately before, but post-First World War it certainly was. And after the Second World War, where we experienced the most awful Holocaust against Jewish people, conventions were tightened even further and put in place in order to provide mechanisms that would allow the world to act when breaches of human rights occurred during instances of war. This is why, with international humanitarian law, you cannot deny a soldier medical treatment just because he's your enemy, right? You cannot deny ordinary civilians access to health care. You cannot deny civilians access to food or other basic necessities. All of this is framed within what we call international humanitarian law. You can't stop aid, in terms of international law, reaching those people. And we framed all this because we understood that human beings are imperfect individuals, and that when they are angry and in a situation of conflict, they forget how to behave properly and are abusive toward others. So I think it's very important that we make reference to the multilateral system and the important role of international law, and particularly the intention to provide for prevention of crimes against humanity, and in particular to prevent genocide. Now, we approached the International Court of Justice as the first port of call for South Africa's government, as it is the world court that is put in place by the global community to adjudicate, to decide upon allegations such as abuse or infringement of human rights, the practice of genocide against a group. When we talk of genocide, we mean something like this, that we know a large part of the people of the Zulu community live in KwaZulu-Natal. We have a group of South Africans who go to KwaZulu with the intention to kill all Zulu people. and all the hostile action is directed at the Zulu people. That is an intention of genocide. When you have action against a select group that targets that particular group and seeks to annihilate them, you have genocide as your intention. So if you look at the Genocide Convention, it defines very clearly what it regards as action that constitutes genocide. Now, we could only approach the International Court of Justice as it is the court that has the right in law, in terms of UN institutions, to actually instruct states with respect to breach of a convention such as the Convention Against Genocide. The Convention of Genocide, and I must explain again, is a convention to which states sign the name of their country and ratify through their parliament. The first member to sign the Genocide Convention was Israel. Why? Because the direct intention of the convention was to address the horrific experience of Jewish people in the Holocaust in Europe. So it was framed in order to address that particular harm that occurred in the course of the Second World War. South Africa is also a state party to the Genocide Convention. Of course, we only ratified after we got freedom. It hadn't been ratified before. So when we were looking at the events unfolding over 3 months in the Palestinian territories, in Gaza in particular, as the government of South Africa, we said to ourselves, surely humanity cannot watch this like a movie on a fiction television screen. This is unconscionable. And we said, as South Africa, we have to do something. We have to say something to draw the world's attention that a major wrong is underway. And we identified the Convention on Genocide as the international instrument that we should utilize to approach the international community. We pursued this legal course of action by requesting the court, one, to investigate and rule on our belief that genocide is underway in the occupied Palestinian territories, but two, we asked the court to urgently rule on provisional measures that we hoped would halt the current onslaught that was underway in December 2023. We made the decision in December through the Cabinet of South Africa. We prepared our papers and we submitted at the end of December to the court with the request on 9 provisional measures and with the request to investigate whether indeed we were correct in our belief that a genocide is underway. The court, in its findings, ordered Israel that it should take all steps within its power to ensure that genocidal acts are not being committed in the war it is waging against the people of Palestine. The court further said, from their initial examination of a range of accounts of what was occurring, there is a plausible case of genocide taking place in Gaza. This was an extremely, extremely important decision by the court. They didn't definitively say there is genocide. They said there's a plausible case. So it merits further investigation, and it's important that we always remind you there isn't a final decision yet. The major case is still to be heard, but the court said there's plausibility. Very important. We believe this case is particularly significant, as it is rare that the International Court of Justice is asked to take on such an important matter of peace and security by a country of the South which approaches the world's highest court. Normally, it is courts of the North, it is countries of the North that approach the courts about Africa. But they were silent this time. So it was an African country, a country of the South, that went to the ICJ, very unusually. And it asked the court to hold Israel as a state party to the convention accountable for the violations we claimed. Our principled stand as a country has renewed the reputation of South Africa as a country which champions human rights, justice, and international law. And it has reinforced our moral authority in the international community. At the moment, because of the case that we have bravely taken up, as a country of the South, we are held in very high regard by hundreds of countries throughout the world. Even the ones that say they don't like what we did, they admire the courage. This has been the most significant foreign policy success of South Africa since the era of President Mandela. And to some degree, it is indicative of the renewal of the African National Congress and its appropriation of established values of the organization. Now, we didn't only have that first approach to the ICJ. We were compelled to approach the International Court again, given the threatened ground offensive in Rafah. You will recall that when the offensive in Gaza began, it was in the south of Gaza, and residents of Gaza were told to move to the north. As they were moving to the north, they were being shot and bombarded. And when they got to the north, they were bombarded again. Then, millions of them moved to Rafah, which is closer to the Egyptian border, just on the border with Egypt. They kept being told, move south, you'll be safer there. Even Israel was saying so to them. And yet each time they moved, they would be bombarded, even as they moved. Now, Rafah is under threat. We lodged, therefore, an urgent request with the ICJ to say to them, could they indicate whether Israel's proposed military operation targeting Rafah breaches the provisional orders that the court handed down in January this year. Our urgent request mentioned the hundreds of thousands of civilians, we told the number is around 1.2 million, who are trapped in Rafah, many of them who are fleeing pursuant to evacuation orders issued by Israel, and who have had to leave areas that have largely been destroyed by Israel. Now, the common refrain we are hearing is that there's an intention to force Palestinians totally out of the occupied territories so that you have a larger Israel and Palestinians are moved into the desert of Egypt. This is unconscionable and it cannot be supported. With the military offensive planned on Rafah, we've seen further large-scale killing. Just 2 days ago, we had 70 people killed. We've seen destruction, and we've seen irreparable breach, in our view, of the Genocide Convention and of the International Court of Justice's ruling, which was handed down at the end of January. The ICJ, in their response to us, noted, in their words, the perilous situation, but they rejected our request to order further urgent measures to safeguard civilians. So they noted our request, noted the danger we pointed to, but they wouldn't order further provisional measures. So today, we sit with about 1.4 million people sheltering in Gaza on the border with Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of them are crammed into what was called a safe area by the Israeli government. And all of them live there largely without proper shelter, and we all know that famine is looming in Rafah and other parts of Palestine. We believe that the only way to enforce the orders of the International Court of Justice is for the UN Security Council to finally take action to protect the civilians of Gaza. The Security Council is the body charged with peace and security in the United Nations, and we believe they must find the mechanism to protect innocent Palestinian civilians. We believe the Security Council must ensure the speedy delivery of humanitarian aid and also must oversee an immediate ceasefire. However, because of the very antiquated decision-making of the Security Council, with the veto of 5 permanent members, it's very difficult for them to agree on any measure. And so the Palestinian people are essentially held hostage by the geopolitics of the permanent 5. And this is a huge problem for the world. We are really worried about the paralysis of the Security Council because they are unable to exercise their mandate to protect innocent people in the world. The United States, as one of the P5, the permanent 5 with a veto, has repeatedly refused to vote for an immediate ceasefire, even when the European Union has now supported the call for a ceasefire. You would have witnessed 2 weeks ago, for the first time ever, the United States didn't veto, they abstained. They didn't have the courage to support, but they abstained. We would like to ask the international community to urgently find ways to pressure Israel to adhere to its obligations under the Genocide Convention and to create conditions and consequences for their non-compliance with the order of the court. Because if Israel is allowed not to act as the court has directed, it means any other murderer can act in a similar fashion. And this is a real danger for ordinary innocent civilians in various parts of the world. Dictators will now believe they have the license to do as they will with innocent people. You will recall that in January, when the ICJ ruled, they said that Israel must report to them within a month on what actions they'd taken in response to the provisional measures. Israel did respond with a report which in our view was wholly disappointing. In their report, they claimed that they are fully committed to conducting their military operation in Gaza in accordance with international law, and went further to say, including the basic international humanitarian law obligations of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attacks. We all know, despite that letter, that Israel has not acted in that way. We all know there's no proportionality. We all know there's no distinction. Any Palestinian anywhere is open to be killed. We all know there are no precautions because many, many are dying as we speak. What we are seeing, though, is something totally frightening today. Starvation is being used as a weapon of war. You might all recall what has become known as the Flower Massacre, when Israeli forces killed 112 people and wounded over 750 as they waited for aid trucks in Gaza City on the 28th of February this year. This is just an example of what we believe is Israel's genocidal campaign. These people were all approaching a truck which had aid and they were all trying to grab food from the truck, and they were short with their backs turned. Israel said they were facing hostile fire, but if you look at all video material, there's no such evidence. Civilians in Gaza are desperately hungry for food aid, and those in the north, where the massacre happened, had not been able to receive any food aid for more than a week, according to the UN Secretary General. Of course, we also know that Israel has attempted to frustrate the work of the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, including efforts which they led, which caused the suspension of funding from the agency, with the full knowledge that this is the only agency that is able to distribute emergency food aid to Palestinians. 9 donors of UNRWA believed the claims, allegations of Israel against aid workers, and they stopped funding the agency. These included United States, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Up to today, since those allegations, Israel has not provided any evidence to back its allegations that 12 aid employees were involved in the October 7th attack by Hamas. Over a month after these allegations were made, UN investigators had waited and waited to receive evidence from Israel to support their claims. The UN Office of Internal Oversight Services reviewed the initial information received by the agency from Israeli authorities, but then received no new evidence from Israel to corroborate the claims. Even an assessment by the United States National Intelligence Council assessed with low confidence that a handful of staffers had participated in the attack. We all know that since the creation of the agency, 1949, Israel has called for it to be dismantled. They don't want aid to be provided to Palestinian people. UNRWA is a major aid agency. It dwarfs every other UN agency and has over 13,000 staff providing aid to Palestinians. It's the only organization able to provide a wide range of government-like services to one of the most destitute communities in the Middle East. What we think has been a positive sign is that there are moves from a number of progressive governments of the left to support South Africa's court at the International Court of Justice, and also to hold those governments that have removed funding from the aid agency responsible for their decision. The ICJ announced in March this year that Nicaragua has sued Germany at the ICJ for funding Israel and for cutting aid to the UN aid agency. The Latin American country, Nicaragua, accused Berlin of violating international law in its continued funding for Tel Aviv and asked the ICJ to order emergency measures which would force Germany to stop military aid to Israel and to restart funding to the aid agency. By sending military equipment to Israel and by removing funding for the aid agency, which provides essential aid to innocent civilians, Nicaragua argued to the court that Germany is also facilitating the commission of genocide. Of course, in our own country, there's been a deafening silence from many political parties, particularly the main opposition, Democratic Alliance, on the genocidal campaign of the Israeli government. Some of you might recall that on 10 March 2022, the Western Cape government, speaking about Ukraine, which had been attacked by Russia, said the following: "We cannot and will not remain silent in the face of a major international crisis that threatens the very foundation of our liberal international order." That was March 2022. But in the face of genocide against Palestinians, in the face of collective punishment, in the face of a clear ethnic cleansing in Gaza, the Premier of the Western Cape and the DA leader and his cabinet have not said a single word in condemnation of these atrocities. For us, this illustrates a double standard and a very selective morality. We have criticized Israel, we've also criticized Hamas, and have called for the release of hostages. DA Speaker in the provincial legislature shamefully decided to silence discussions on Israel's genocide in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis unfolding. And he did this and stopped the Western Cape legislature for having any debate on this matter, exposing the DA's disregard for democratic values and the gravity of human rights concerns. And you would all recall that a senior leader of the DA was axed from a committee, Mr. Khalib Kachalia, for saying on X, "I will not be silenced. Israel is committing genocide, full stop." That's what he wrote on X. The DA party leader, Mr. Steenhuisen, called his remark a display of remarkable selfishness and disregard for a formal decision of the DA's National Caucus. And he claimed that by removing Kachalia from the DA shadow cabinet, the DA was prioritizing the best interests of the party. The ICJ ruling followed the statement Kachalia made and his action, and clearly discredits the views of the Democratic Alliance. As the African National Congress government, we will continue to lead the charge for justice for the Palestinian people, because we believe we have a directive from President Nelson Mandela when he said our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. Our intention is to continue to approach the International Court of Justice to strengthen the measures that they set out in January. We will also continue the approach we first made last year to the International Criminal Court concerning our belief that they should investigate possible war crimes by Israeli leaders and by Hamas leaders. As South Africans, we cannot rest until Palestine is free, just as Palestinians did not desert us until we were free. I thank you very much, Executive Secretary, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Minister.
Rich.